one of the first things that caught my eye that one of our viewers asked today was how do we keep up with the growing number of managed services with different cloud providers? And Kelsey has already astutely pointed out that it has to be a community effort, right? This is too large of a task for a very small team to maintain, especially those without proprietary domain knowledge of those services. So I'd love to get both your takes around how you think a community can organize around creating a standard set of controllers for all these different cloud providers and any managed service provider for that matter.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a couple routes. I think the Terraform community demonstrated over the years what collaboration looks like in a space like that. But one thing I've seen over the last 10 years is Puppet built a bunch of resources. They live and they will die with Puppet. Chef community has done the same thing, Ansible community, Terraform community. So there's a pattern here. We keep rewriting these providers in every tool that comes out. And at some point, I think the way Terraform does it, where there's like this plugin architecture that allows these to be like more interfaces or, RESTful services, if you will, that's going to allow some reuse. So I think what needs to happen is, one, the community, if they adopt this controller pattern, ideally these are just small containerized applications that know how to reconcile state. And one of the states that we're targeting is a declarative API, aka Kubernetes, but that doesn't have to be the only one. And the last thing I'll say here is, I mentioned in the chat, Google Cloud has a thing called Config Connector. And we are either A, leveraging some of the goodness that's already in Terraform, since a lot of Googlers already maintain the providers inside of Terraform, so we can interface into those. And there's going to be cases where we just have to create brand new controllers and have those available. So that way, I think cloud providers are going to also have to bring a lot to the table. And ideally, those things should be compatible with Crossplane's ability to create meta things on top and to enforce policy as a layer above.
Yeah, definitely a community effort, and I agree that we should, that part of our, why we're taking the project to the CNCF, and part of why we're actually trying to, get this more people around the table and getting the project to grow is essentially to get to reach the level of ubiquity. We think that the industry is at a good place with getting, converging on things like the Kubernetes API, and the pattern around managing CRDs and controllers. And we'd love to kind of get everyone involved in getting to critical mass around something like, the providers for Crossplane and not having to repeat this work over and over again.
Definitely. Both the things that y'all said reminds me of a lot of things like the container storage interface or container runtime interface, standardizations that we've agreed on as a community that allow us to interface with things that are going to be consumed through a separate system. So I definitely agree that that is a great path forward. Some other questions that we've gotten in the chat, specifically around secrets. Obviously, we're provisioning these managed services, different infrastructure on different providers, and those have connection information. So we've already done some things in Crossplane to allow you to consume those in applications, and we're specifically going to see some of that later on with some of the OAM demos that we're going to see. But there is kind of an open question in the general community about how you connect applications and workloads to the infrastructure that they're consuming. Do either one of you have thoughts on what that could look like? I imagine, once again, a community agreed on definition is the right direction to go there, but I'd love to hear your particular thoughts about that topic.
Yeah, for me, this is just room for experimentation. The higher you go up in this pyramid is when you start to get so many differences of opinion, right? So the thing that we talked about, and at least in my demo, was the ability to take some assets or artifacts from a resource you create. For example, when you create that database, there's going to be connection details like the URL, the secret, the username, and you can store those in a place that in the Kubernetes world, a secret that you can consume via environment variables or off the file system. But you also can have a higher level definition. I think there's where a lot of room for experimentation is going to lie. I've seen a lot of people try to standardize this over the years. If you think about it, Heroku and Cloud Foundries are an attempt to standardize how apps consume infrastructure end to end. I think Kubernetes may present a different opportunity to have a little bit more flexibility in how we define it, but I really doubt there will be just one. But I think Kubernetes is going to let us try to figure that out sooner or later.
Yeah, I agree. Agree with Kelsey on this one. Sorry.
Awesome. So specifically with different implementations being in place for how to interact with these different cloud providers, how do we go about creating a community where things can interact well? So Kelsey's already shown that you can interact with Crossplane via Terraform or something like that. How can we continue to drive ways where even projects that are disparate and not necessarily agreeing on the same standardization can still call into each other and utilize the functionality presented?
Yeah, I've been using this term infrastructure as data for a while, and it's really infrastructure as code. But the reason why emphasize the data part, what I just shown is like this cross-plane allows you to build your own control plane, and it's this declarative data-driven thing. Thank you, Kubernetes, for giving us this model. And you have to do a lot of work with code on the back end. So I don't want to have this illusion that there'd be no more code. It just lives in a specific place. And now that we have this high-level DSL, now we have a clear set of data models that all of the tools can share. So whether I want to use Helm, Terraform, or any other tool, they now have a thing that they can target. So instead of them learning gRPC or REST, like Google Cloud presents, maybe we have a data model. And I talked about that in the chat with like the config connector, right? That's just one way of accessing Kubernetes resources through a Kubernetes style API. I think the crossplane, the middle layer, just says, it clicked for me like yesterday when I was kind of writing some of these configs. You essentially have a world where if you have a bunch of definitions already in play, you can almost define your own meta controller using YAML, if you will, right? You don't have to learn all the bits about Kubernetes. I can take the high level cross-plane kind of DSL, and what it's basically doing for me is allowing me to describe a data model that's composed of others, extract fields from others, and do that control loop for me. I don't really have to write a controller from scratch. And I think that's like the Rails moment. It could be the Rails moment for people that are creating controllers that don't want to start from scratch.
Yeah, I'd say like we've seen this in other fields as well. Like API enabled a ton of B2B services and enabled essentially companies to exist that are solely just consuming API. And you could argue how many dollars are how much value is created on top of API at this point, right? Yet for infrastructure, most of the convergence that has happened in the past has happened around tooling, right? Tools, not necessarily API, right? And so one of the things that I think is cool about uh, you know converging on an API is it does enable a much wider ecosystem to build on top of. I'm not talking about API that just remotely runs a plan or remotely. I'm talking about an API that's essentially granular. Every resource, kind of like what you expect out of a cloud provider today, right? And if you look at the cloud providers themselves, they're massive platforms that are API based, right? And so we kind of need a similar thing. And so what we're saying is this API layer needs to exist. It needs to be open. It needs to be part of the community. But kind of to the point, every platform, every company is going to look different. So they kind of need their own API. You can't find a one size fits all for everyone. It's things like Heroku are great until you fall off a cliff and have to migrate off of it because it doesn't handle a certain scenario for you, right? And so when companies end up building their own platforms, we're promoting that they do that in a API-driven, an API-centric way. I mean, we call it what you want to call it, but if they have an internal API that is layered on top of a public API, something that then we kind of close the loop there.
Definitely. That's a great point. And one of the things I'm really excited about with composition, which is a newer feature that Kelsey really highlighted in his demo, is that you could essentially create a platform as a service for your internal organization and have that all committed into a Git repo. So I'm excited to see things like someone publishing their platform as a service so that another organization, let's say a startup, takes a piece of a larger organization's platform as a service, and they're able to just basically deploy that in a Kubernetes cluster where Crossplane is running, and then they're able to tweak it as they grow and mature and have their own needs and desires. But you can kind of share these abstractions that you create, and there can be a lot of tooling around that as well. So doing that directly from a Git repo, or we've talked about different packaging formats, which folks will see some of if they try out Upbound in the community preview today. So there's a lot of opportunities for maturation in that area. Kelsey, I wanted to specifically ask you because obviously you came into Crossplane and we're ready to do this keynote and prepared a demo and that sort of thing. What kind of things do you think would make it easier for a new user to get started using Crossplane? We've talked a lot about different personas of people that using Crossplane. So there's kind of the infrastructure operator, platform team person. There's the application owner, which once again, we'll get into that a little bit more with OAM folks today. And then, so you have this two-sided model where there's people defining the abstractions and people consuming them. How do you personally think, as a new user coming to Crossplane, this can be made easy to synthesize and understand for someone who's new?
So it's early days. I think a lot of the complexity needs to live somewhere. So look, it's going to be a bit of YAML for now. That's how we're going to generate these controllers. And I think that's fine. People have to get comfortable with that. I think the things that would help new people is understanding what the North Star is. Your goal isn't to build another set of scripts, right? That's not what you're doing here. So a lot of the fundamentals you already understand, right? When people used to write bash scripts, you're composing various tools. And ideally, if you add flags to that bash script, that becomes the interface to that. Great. But the thing is, we're now in an era where people want like an API, right? One where you can interact with various tools and not exec bash scripts. So it's just a progression of that idea. So I think you have to make sure that you understand you're really trying to up-level your platform offering to match that we have seen in the cloud. We're trying to elevate a little bit. And if you can do that, then you'll understand why this stuff is necessary, because you have to separate the consumer of your platform from the creation of your platform. And I think if you're going to be a new user to Crossplane and you agree that, hey, I would like to provide an API on top of my infrastructure, and that's going to be the contract boundary between me and the consumers. Now, you may serialize your culture. So I like to think about Kubernetes and its APIs and how it looks. You can serialize the way your company wants to work, meaning developers wish that they could get secrets in this way. Developers wish that they could just tell you this and get this as a result. Whatever your culture wants, you can start to now build out those contracts in the form of a control plane. And I think that's the thing that new users need to see. Is it going to be easy? Like, we overemphasize easy sometimes to just like get a quick wow moment, but then there's no path to what happens when we need to be in production. So I think the complexity that people see, you have to be able to try to embrace it, give feedback to make it better, but at the same time, understand where the North Star is, and it may be worth it.
Definitely. I think that's a great point. And Bassam, I have a follow-up question for you, but one thing I would have mentioned on that is as one of the maintainers on Crossplane, one of the things we talk about quite a bit is what deserves to be kind of a component in the system versus tooling layered on top, right? And we try to have a really disciplined approach about how we represent managed services one-to-one so that we don't remove any functionality that the cloud provider is offering to you. And then any abstractions and user experience, we try to add on top of that so that you use your primitives to make your experience better. So I think that's a great point about thinking about what can be pushed to the tooling side and maybe the client side, and then what's more on the server system side and is supported by the system itself. Kind of following on to a lot of the things Bassam, Kelsey said, Bassam, I'd like for you to talk just briefly about what your kind of outlook is from an Upbound perspective about making this user experience better, about defining your own platforms and kind of building your own abstractions that can be consumed within an organization.
I mean, I think just for something like this to become kind of mainstream, if you will, you have to have the tooling around it. You can't be writing the YAML. You can't be doing all the, templating and mustache style templates and all. It has to be, a turnkey experience. The model we have, like the vision I have for what we want to do in Upbound Cloud is something like you have a single person, a cloud engineer, right, if you will, that could spend a day in front of a UI, and by the end of the day, they have their own Heroku. Meets their compliance standards, meets their security standards, uses their infrastructure, using their cloud accounts, is able to, pass compliance tests somewhere, right? And they do that all without writing code. Kind of like, if you will, in a very different space, right? You have if I wanted to empower my sales team, I can go to something like Copper or Salesforce.com or HubSpot, create a bunch of playbooks, and at the end of the day, I have a set of workflows that my sales team can use to start closing deals, right? That's the level we need to get to as platform builders. We need to be able to build our own customized platform because you're not going to find one that fits exactly, right? So instead, we focus on how do we make it really easy to build your own platform that serves a real API, looks like a cloud provider API for the services and resources you want to expose to your application teams. And then all the tooling can layer on top of the API, right? And so we're passionate about getting that to run and work well for the enterprise.
I want to jump in with one quick reminder to people as we start getting towards the end here. Remember, Kubernetes, you inherit a bunch of control plane things. Like RBAC is a very hard thing that most people never incorporate in their APIs. Never will they have the ability to have very detailed role-based access control, fundamentally deep up and down the resource level. The other thing that you get in the Kubernetes ecosystem, right, where control plane or cross-plane lives, the things like a mission controllers where you can start to layer policy engines on top. So things like OPA become something that you can do kind of as a hook into a lot of this, right? So not only is I think having this layered approach that Crossplane brings in, one thing that I hope Crossplane can help people do is also abstract some of the policy hooks that they would want to do, right? Like give people the ability to say, even though I define this meta resource, maybe I can also have the policy be decorated around that. So that way it's still just a single step. And now I have the equivalent of a cloud provider's IAM model, right? Your authorization backend, who are you, authentication, but then have authorization baked in at a resource level of granularity. I think that is going to be a game changer that really will flip the bit for people coming from a more of a scripting mindset to a control plane mindset.
There's definitely a ton of machinery that we are, leveraging here. All the great work that has happened in the Kubernetes community, almost all of it applies to what we're doing on Crossplane, which is fantastic.
Absolutely. And you'd think that we would have given Kelsey that line to move us on to the next section, because that was a great segue. For folks that are interested in some of the ways that we integrate with different projects that standardize on the Kubernetes API, definitely stay tuned for all the talks that we have today. We also have a bi-weekly live stream show where we essentially just have on a new cloud native project every other week. And we talk about how they can integrate together. And then we publish demos showing how to do that. So some of the projects that we've had on include Octeto and OPA, which are both presenting today. We've also shown things like OpenFaz and Knative and different projects like that, as well as backup and restore with projects like Valero. So there's lots of opportunities to utilize that Kubernetes API there.